And the Nardini would be something that you'll learn a lot and you could probably play. And I said, I think I'd like to do the Nardini. He said, fine. And that was a good decision. But talk about building in tension, you can imagine. And it's not that far from what I've seen. So then I happen to love etudes, okay? Call it a twisted gene, I don't know. I really do. But the reason I like them is that having started as an adult, I could always look at them and say, it was just like a French assignment. You could look at it and say, what am I getting out of this? And if you go after something specific, don't just go at it, but you know why you're doing it, then it's interesting. I love puzzles, it's part of the big puzzle. The best thing about etudes is you can say to a student, what's this for? And they'll give you a correct answer, say, what else is it for? And you can go and do this for an hour, because it can be for almost as many things as you want it to be, especially when you get into sort of more comprehensive etudes up in past, Kaiser, Mazas, and then Kreutzer, Fiorillo, it's all there. So if the student has a very, very strong sense of purpose in going after this etude, and if you're really religious about it, you can build a wonderful, wonderful bank account technique from which the student can draw.
Okay.
Yes?
One, following up on your comment about the intonation
Yeah.
and the importance of playing in tune, my experience in some circumstances also with the adjudication was I would give the sight reading. The sight reading would be impeccably in tune for something that was much simpler as compared to the things that were prepared in certain instances, which I found very interesting yesterday.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So it really was not an issue of hearing or knowing where to put fingers or anything about that. It was about the difficulty of the piece.
I think you're right.
So, and I hadn't really recognized that quite as much as I did yesterday in some situations. So that's a good reminder for all of us, I think, to not be afraid to give a piece that's at the correct level.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I'm so glad you interjected with that, because when I was, I'm not trying to name drop, but there are a couple of teachers, you honor your teachers by quoting them really, and I asked Ms. DeLay what she thought was the correct sequence of things to teach somebody who's only an adult beginner who doesn't know anything would ask a wonderful question like that. And she said it really depends on the student, but she said the scales and arpeggios should be the hardest thing they're working on. Interesting, and then the etudes. And then the piece should mostly have things that they are capable of doing.
Yeah.
And then there's the other added increment, maybe the little stretch factor, and there's always going to be something in there. Now, I asked sort of the same question to Eric, but was more about time allocation in a piece. And he said that mostly when he picked up a piece, he'd say 65% of it, he could play it a few times and he could play it. Then maybe another 15-20%. It might take him a few hours, and he'd have it, 10 hours. And he said, then there's the remaining 15%-ish. He said that's going to take 20 times as much work as anything else. So, if you have any sort of literal-minded child who thinks all things should be treated equally, it's time to dispel that factor and focus on the places. And those are the ones, that will be out of tune in these pressured things or, challenging experiences. The really funny part is that the part that took you like 20 times more to learn, you don't want your audience to know where it was. That's a little frustrating. You want badges, but there are no badges. But I think building strength, actually, when I did my intensive, I had a physical therapist, somebody with whom I was working for my back at the time, come and, it was so interesting. he talked about how speed requires strength. So that's why when we don't practice for a few days, the fingers feel like sausages and they don't want to do anything, because our strength is diminished. And when we're in really good shape, it feels like we could play anything. And we probably could, because they're ready, they're in fighting trim. And building it with ease, that's the challenge. And I keep saying this because I think it's, again, I go back to the elevator speech. If it were part of what I could say in, between the first and the fifth floor, building advanced skills with ease is so critical. And I think also that there's far too much faking that we accommodate in these auditions. And one of the problems is that the kids are always taking an audition for this or that. It's either seating, or it's getting into the next orchestra, or it's to be in a festival of some kind, like district. All of these things are wonderful. They're great. But there's so much pressure to have the next piece and the next piece, and sometimes you don't get to choose the piece, and sometimes that's really not a good piece for your child. So sometimes you have to stand up on your hind legs and say, no, I don't recommend this. All of those things have the following problems. They take away from the time working on the scales, arpeggios and etudes, double stops, developing a beautiful vibrato, which is a whole life experience in itself. All of these things, and building like etudes that you might start in détaché and then use a smaller and smaller bow and finally develop a spiccato out of it. They can be sort of long-term-ish projects, like the vibrato. And you need to have some continuity to do these things, and you're always being interrupted and barraged by, and everybody's nodding their heads, so I think this is a pretty common experience. So sometimes the discussion can be had, for right now, what would be best for you, from my point of view as your teacher, is that we just not necessarily take all these things on and give you time to work on the things that are going to make you able to play harder pieces. What do you say? Very often the kids are okay with that. Sometimes they really want to do it, then there's value in that. And I think that we have to honor their passion too. But there's always a balance. So there's also harder pieces, longer pieces, and long rehearsals. God, do I hate it when someone walks in and they keep rubbing this muscle. And I say, are you hurting? Oh, no. I have a little knot here. We all know this. They're not too young, by the way, to learn a few stretches. We all know about that because, we're all, some of us are over 35. There's a good range of them, and my personal favorite is if the water level were here and I were doing the crawl with my face down. But one needs to hold the head and neck carefully and well for this. And this is going back to a little bit of Alexander, the crown of the head. This is the highest one, and tuck in the chin just a little. And then use up. I got taller, I could feel it. I like getting taller. So you can feel yourself elongate the spine. They can learn these things. It's good for them to learn it. The thing is, they're young enough now that they get away with murder. They use their bodies badly. Injury's going to happen, unless they correct this, because when they get to 18, it's all downhill from there. Well, my father said 23, but I think 18. And they can learn a more correct usage. And I've seen girls with this 12th century Madonna slouch that just, it kills me. And if they take this seriously, they can actually avoid injury. Avoiding injury is like not smoking. If you didn't do it, you might take for granted all the good things you've done for yourself. The other thing is playing from the mind and heart right from the start. I think from the mind, with your practicing, we talked about being thoughtful and analytical in the practicing. They have to learn to do this. It doesn't just come, that, oh, I know how to analyze this. So that idea of asking, why are we doing this age? What are we looking for? Is useful. I'm really into to-do lists right now. I have each student keep a notebook, and I really push them to get a spiral-bound music paper notebook so that I can write out little exercises, which I only do occasionally, but without having to draw the staff.
Yeah.
It just doesn't look good. If they're usually really smart, these kids, but they need you to say, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and then play through. Rather than play through, get to the point where they make a mistake, fix it, and keep going. What have they learned when they do that?
They've learned how to make a mistake at that same height.
Exactly.
They get good at it.
Great consistency, yeah.
Precisely. They are brilliant at it, in fact, and it's not really where they want to go. So, that's that whole thing. You learn everything you do, so set up the practice so that you can avoid those pitfalls. And they can learn to think about this. We were talking about, my twisted gene that I like etudes, and it's because I enjoy finding out what's there. That's the process-oriented work. So it's not play through, check it off. Experiencing the joy of the emotional response to one's playing. I find this a really hard one. In this MCAS era, everybody wants the right answer. What's the right answer? All the right notes? All the right rhythms? I got it. Now just walk it down, right? And I'd say no. Actually, that's the biggest mistake of all. And if they, through imaging, like with the Mozart concerto, the idea of it as opera, identifying the characters, since they're not original ideas, they just work. They're good ideas. If you can do the same thing with Zeitz, you can do the same thing with any of the 19th century, Benotti, all of them. If they can start to live that character, they come outside of themselves a little bit. I love talking to them about the MCAS mentality. I'm very forthright with them. I'm not pulling any punches. This is not about right answers, kids. There's no right answer. I can't call up Benotti and say, did she do that right? It's probably a good thing I can't. He's so limited. I can tell them something about him, and I can ask them to go look him up on the internet and come back and give me a report. He might not be exactly the one I'd want them to look up with. Usually, though, there's a sort of a breakthrough point with a child who's been sort of inhibited. And they surprise themselves a little bit. They start to really play. And there was one girl that I had, and I told Eric about this. We had a wonderful discussion, and he was in the process of writing his book about becoming an artist. And this girl was playing Mozart, and she was playing, I think it was Mozart 3, and she was playing it, first movement, very nicely, but like a stone. And I asked her, I said, I need some of you in there. We talked a little bit. And she explained to me that where she came from, the instruction was to do it just as the teacher tells you. Mm-hmm. So she was waiting for that. And I said, well, you don't live there anymore. And then she started to think about it a little bit. And I said, I really don't want to tell you how to play this, but I would like you to listen to it and play it as you're hearing inside your head, as you're living. My God, she just knocked me over. I'm playing for her, right? And she played so wonderfully. And I wouldn't say it was the definitive edition. I wouldn't necessarily record her for Columbia Artists, but I would tell you that was a breakthrough moment. We've all experienced this in teaching at some time. And for her, it was a discovery that it was all there waiting to be counted. But the best part was I asked her if she liked it better that way. She said yes. Well, if you like it better, don't hold yourself back from it. Nobody's. The devil doesn't make you do it, and the devil doesn't prevent you from doing it. It's up to you. It's kind of fun. Those are the great moments, I think, teaching. And there, you free the inherent natural artist. You find out where that talent is. And so what if it isn't the next Mozart? Who cares? That person has something to fulfill, and you help bring it out. And then you give them the tools that they can keep developing that. That's really a good thing. Any more questions, anything to do with that? Or should we fly on? Okay. Interdependent flow of learning. You ever have a student say to you, well, there's just so many things to remember, right? That's right, there are. That's one of the issues that's hard, you know, and you don't want to bombard them too much because there's a point where they can't do more. So let's go back a little bit. Defining correctness. You know, as I was trying to prepare this course, I was thinking, okay, someone's going to say, well, what's correct? And that would be a really legitimate question. So I wanted to be sort of generic about it, but it seems when the skills are correct, they enable the next thing to happen. And that's, I'd go a little further. I would say that there would be some things that need to be in place, that it would have to be done with ease, that it would not have any of the built-in problems, issues, and that there's a strength to execute it, the physical strength and flexibility. Yeah, that was the other thing that Tom said, was that flexibility and strength give us speed, and that's important. Flexibility, again, these little guys need to be used. They have synovial fluid in the joints, just as dancers do class every day to keep their joints limber. We need to use them. Kids need to understand this. The body, if you don't use those joints, the body says, oh, she doesn't need that. I'm not making so much synovial fluid today. You use it, the body says, ooh, gotta lubricate, and that joint will stay lubricated. That's only the joints. I'm not even talking about the muscles now. But, so each of these skills, which for the sake of the course, I limited again, I listed again here, depends on all of those things. And then there's a logic, and this is what I started in the beginning of saying that this was beginning to sort of discern itself, or distill itself for me. But the efficiency of motion and effort, now I'm married to a physicist, and he'll sometimes talk about, you know, he's working on experimental stuff, and he comes, this is so elegant, it's so simple. and then if you look at the great players you see. It looks simple, doesn't it? It's elegant because they're not flapping all over the place. Everything, their motions are sort of economical, but beautiful. And the simplicity and elegance is also functional. It works. What happens when we're struggling with a really hard passage? You have a student who's using way too much bow and the coordination is totally wacko and the arms are akimbo and they're flying. They're flapping. They're trying to get off the ground, working too hard. And that's where the simplicity is elegant. So the smaller bow, knowing that it's just here, that it does, the shoulder's job is to do basically very little or nothing, depending on your school of thought. All of that, that's simplicity. Integration and dovetailing of skills. Well, okay, I want to teach a child vibrato. I want to teach them third position. What a great way to get started with third position. They can park the hand here, you know, against the rib, and begin to do some vibrato scales just in third position. Nobody has trouble with it. It's easy. And they're learning third position. They'll know the notes without even knowing that they learned third position. So it's pretty painless. And then progressing on from there into, in Brimley on pages 19 and 20, and I know this is the most famous place of all my students, there's scales on one string and arpeggios on one string. And if they do like slurring every two notes, like this, even students who've never shifted before, when you start, I like to use it just to get them through it and then ask them to start acquiring shifting skills. And I use the various, there's several different keys. So, except I'm being bad, I should use the whole bow, right? So that's the organization I like to use, so that they always have to shift under a slur. Why? I don't want them to shift fast. I want them to hear it. Why? Because I'm not training my finger. I'm training my brain. I'm training my ear to hear when to stop. All right, does that make sense? So the brain plays the violin. The fingers are the obedient slaves. But what do the slaves do when the brain doesn't give clear direction? They run amok. They flap. They do everything they can. Yeah.
One of the things I learned about what the fingers and the nerves are doing is that your fingers also measuring the strength.
Absolutely.
So to be going that slowly allows the brain. I tell the students, you don't know what that exact measurement is, but your finger and your
Yeah.
brain do.
No, I think that's valid, and please, I'm glad you said that, because I don't mean to discount the spatial learning, which I think is there, but I think students tend to go for the spatial and not really be listening, and
have to listen to get there. Yeah.
and they know they have to shift fast. They know eventually they have to, so they want to do that right. And that's not going to get them there. The other thing is, we have what we call the famous finger picture. And I'm just going to draw you one really quickly. I should have put this in here. Excuse me for a second. And this is presumably the same finger, even though it looks a little weird each time. So this is, I don't know if you can see this, but I'll try to make it so. This is when you're on a note, this is when you're shifting, and this is when you're back on a note. So there's air underneath the string, okay? This is the shift. This is the note, this is the next note.
I don't understand.
Okay, so my finger's going shifting, right? And I'm lightening the pressure on the string.
Oh,
And then I
just
sit,
showing the
so it's just,
release. Okay,
yeah, it
yeah.
just shows that release. That's a good way to put it. So that's, the students all have this in their Rimley book. And this allows then various things that you add, like doing a thumb preparation, leading with the elbow, going up past third and fourth position, and leading back. The thumb preparation becomes the leading back, going down, and putting a new finger over the old, shifting down from the high position. These are all standard things, but that particular page allows you, once they get one of those things, you can build on it and add another. I would never give it all at once, but again, that's one of those wonderful long-term projects that you really need time to spend on and not get ignored because you just had another audition. But yes. So through things like that, students develop awareness of process, taking things in steps, and cultivating practice skills, excuse me for a second, throughout. And that, let's start with a practice time and space. I spoke a little about the practice time and not being so tired you barely can lift your arm, never mind, think. Sometimes when you ask students where they practice, you get the weirdest answers. And they can be in rather chaotic spaces where concentration is probably not possible. I think also a little bit on the idealistic side, perhaps, but still necessary, is a mirror. So they can use that mirror as a good teaching tool, not just in your studio, but when they're at home. So, advising some thought about those logistics. I wouldn't have thought of this when I was younger, because I just always took it for granted, but it's astounding when you ask the question.
Maria, a question I've been asking lately is, do you use your music stand? And that's because the answer so often has been no.
What?
Yeah, a lot of students don't have music stands
Either
at
don't
home.
have it or they have it and they don't use
You don't
it.
take it out anymore.
They don't wanna unfold it or, you know, set it up.
Yeah.
The band,
Oh,
So sometimes I find a discussion with the parents then is really helpful.
wow.
about that.
I just wrote that down, Joe.
The other interesting one a couple years ago was from a student whose father is a nurse and works the night shift and didn't want noise while sleeping. And viola practice was a problem. And she was very happy to spend $5 and buy a practice mute. And it didn't have to happen all the time. But, I mean, all of us have stories, I'm sure, of figuring out the right question to ask about that.
Yeah, that is good. Thank you. Wow. Okay, the next thing I like to do with a new student, and I don't care what level they are, is to establish a practice clock. And I'm not trying to train them to be clock watchers, but if I take a new student, I sort of have a verbal commitment of at least an hour a day. And they can have one day off a week, except it can't be the day of, before, or after their lesson. Other than that, they got 4 days from which to choose. It doesn't always really work that way, but I want them to understand that I do expect them. And then I will call their attention to that when it begins to feel to me like this is really not happening. The practice clock. I will divide, I like to know what kind of clock they like. Of course, nowadays it's all digital, so it's not fun, but used to be all kinds of clocks. And then say, okay, well, we're on a 1 hour clock here, so I want to divide into 3 general areas. One would be general technique, one would be etudes, and one would be repertoire. So the conspicuously absent is orchestra music. And then maybe depending on what age they are and what we're working on and what's in that general technique category determines, but it's probably going to be 15 to 20 minutes average. And it would include the vibrato exercises, Schrodiak, book 1. I love that book. And my students don't, but I do. And then scale book and arpeggios, scales and arpeggios, okay? And shifting exercises like that, Rimley, page 19 and 20. So that's going in that category. And then the etudes would be Kaiser, Mazas, Fiorillo, Levinson, whatever they're doing, Kreutzer. And then the last part is repertoire. And for the kids who are getting more adept, I like to have them working on unaccompanied Bach and a solo piece at the same time. So this is getting on a little bit. But I don't want them looking at the clock and saying, oh, gotta change. This is not my objective, nor do I want them saying, 20 minutes more. I want them to have a sense of proportion and not come to me and say, all I did was work on my piece this week because I have a workshop. No. This is an army advancing. We don't want the battle of the Bulge. We want all fronts covered, so we have to go for it. Now, that's idealistic, it doesn't always work out. I understand that, but it's better for them to understand why it's useful and supportive for them to keep doing the basic technical work every day, as well as focusing on that piece that they're going to have to perform that week. So there's a little sense of perspective about it. And they usually tell me that they find that's helpful to them, that it takes a little off them, this burden of trying to know what to do next and how much of it they should do. I like to encourage them to follow processes which break down problems into the component issues and then build them back up. And I love it when they tell me that they've designed their own process. So they, eventually, many of them will get more creative like that about their practicing. That can be things like, some people call it building backwards, some people call it back chaining, where you start with the end of a passage, then you build in a little bit more, and build on a little more. And of course, the obvious advantage there is that instead of entering this dangerous thicket and saying, when am I going to trip, the further in you go, the better you know it. So it really does work wonderfully. Another thing is encouraging them, once they know the notes in a passage, to play it fast the first time, and then play it again slower. Play it again slower. Play it again slower. They're building in relaxation, but the first time, what do they build in? the go for it mentality, the courage to jump, to go, and not building this. So there's all kinds of psychology, this, you all know this, but those are kinds of things that you can get them to look at how they're approaching it.
That's a good question.
Please.
I was just wondering, it's so difficult to, I mean, we've all asked someone to play something slower and had them play it exactly the same speed, probably over, and no, that wasn't slower, make it really slower, and exactly the same speed. So, other than using the metronome, do you have tricks for getting them to actually
I'm
be
very
able to
stubborn.
like,
I'm very stubborn. We may do it 8 or 10 times.
But
And
you-
what part of slow do you not get?
so you just keep telling them,
Yeah.
it's still not slower, can you
Yeah.
really slow yourself down? And,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes you have to be a little brutal, but that's a love relationship, yeah.
I have a suggestion for that. Even when I put on the metronome and I ask them to do it slower and I set the metronome slow, they're still gonna rush and they're ahead of the metronome. So I have them put down their violin and sing it to the metronome
that's
because
good.
it's hard for them to play and follow the metronome at the same time, but they can sing and point and follow the notes until then they get the tune in their head at that speed. And because oftentimes the recordings are very fast and they shouldn't really be playing it at that speed when they're learning it. So I make them sing it and really internalize it, and then I let them pick up the violin.
Well, that's wonderful.
Well, I was wondering more, because this is for a student who can play with the metronome, and if I prescribe them speeds, they'll practice it at
Yeah.
that speed with the metronome. But the
Yeah.
ability to judge, okay, I'm going 90 miles an hour, 60, 40.
Is it a fifth grade boy? Forget about it.
It's a few.
Well, you know, the other piece of that, and I think you're really addressing this, is that there needs to be some physicality. I remember, if with counting issues, the idea of being, having to conduct, and if they don't know the beat patterns, who cares, just pulse. But then to say the rhythm against that beat. So I think when you have them sing, you're also inducing or introducing that that element of physicality. But other than that, I'd just be really stubborn. You're the mom, you know, because you're the mom, that's why. What? The evolving artist. I think students have a hard time at first understanding that they're their own teacher. 6 days a week. Of course, if you threaten to go live with them, they'll probably get it faster. I think that's really scary for them because they really, you know, well, I don't know how to teach myself. Well, yeah, you don't, but following the to-do list and knowing that if you stay with something and you trust the process, and sometimes it is an act of trust because we know where they're going and they don't know where they're going, that they will achieve. And that wonderful thing that happens when they do something well and you praise them, and or they play well for a recital or whatever happens and they have the wind in their sails, that's a great one. So this sometimes brings on, you know, success breeds success, and it does for us too. Confidence, ease, and performance skills, well, you know, it's miles. They need to play a lot. They need to perform a lot. They need to be out there. But there are other tools. We all, some people don't like to talk about stage fright, and some people do. I've even had the experience of addressing it in workshops and then being taken to task for making the student nervous by talking about it. Okay, well, we all have our opinions and I respect that, but I do think that one tool that's very useful is meditation. And this is not in any religious sense, but we know it can slow the heart. And I know I find it very useful if I have to play, so I think it can be good for them. And I've had students use this very easily, but they have to practice it. And they have to practice doing it at home because you don't just pop into a meditative state before you go out and do your student recital. That does not happen. But Basically, I just ask them to find a comfortable place to sit where they won't be interrupted and to just empty the brain. And if thoughts occur, don't hold them, just let them go out. But practice this clearing and then play their piece after they've done this for a few minutes. And like all skills, it takes practice, but I've had very nice results with it. I was always a little afraid to introduce this because I didn't want people to think that I was like trying to do some religious thing with them, but I've never had any flack over it, and I think that it's a very useful skill. And the other piece of it is, again, stepping back, it's about how they can feel they're in control rather than, God, I hope that adrenal gland doesn't shoot off all that adrenaline because I'm going to be sunk. And I think that's a terrible thing, to feel that you're afraid of being afraid. And if they feel rather that the mind is cleared, and if any excitement that comes from playing, instead of being negative, can be channeled into the playing, and that's very ideal. I know, but why not be ideal? What we do is idealistic. And I think it helps them think about that focus, that also trains focus. And if we are doing anything with thoughtful practice, with memory work, for performances, it's training focus. It's this amazing brain training that these kids are getting. To trust their own experience, to trust their skills. At some point say, I trust that I'm going to go out there and deliver what I've done, what I have to offer. And experience, there's the mileage, many miles. So listed, under techniques for independent work, well, these are all things we've talked about. Their skills, various things. Establishing a basic routine. Boy, I'm going to put that music stand thing in there. That's good. But I think also there is something about the brain that, you can do the same thing over and over, and then you start to be thinking about who's playing outside and what are we having for dinner and whatever. Maybe it's a good idea to understand that the brain can be tricked. You could do a line of Schrodiak really carefully, repeating it over and over, faster and faster, or whatever skill you're after. And then you can do some of another etude, and then you can come back and do another line of Schrodiak. And then you can go do something on your piece, just working on a spot. And then you can do salt in another line of Schrodiak. So you can trick your brain into doing much more work than you thought. You can also suggest to your student that they can do that with homework. Do your Spanish, then practice for 20 minutes. Do your math, then practice for 20 minutes. Do your history. Another 20 minutes, and you've got your hour, okay? Many of my kids find that this actually helps them, that they don't just stay with the same thing, getting blurry-eyed, and then try to switch gears, but they keep tricking themselves. So that's worth experimenting. It's personal, it depends on the person, really. I'm just trying to see if we have anything we haven't really talked about. Oops, there's a typo. Okay. I think we should ask them to play musically from the start. Even if it's the simplest pieces. And not just assume that that will come in later. Maybe that goes without saying, I'm not sure. But I hear enough of the playing that's like waiting for someone to tell them how, that I think the playing musically comes from a combination of one's own response to the music and even in a deeper understanding of what the music is really asking us to do, reading the roadmap accurately, understanding the harmonic progression, whatever it is. And of course, supporting that wonderfully is if there's any theory training later on so they understand harmony, that's useful. Okay, so here we go. The pitfall with repertoire is that choosing too demanding a piece can easily induce tension, will undermine carefully well structured skills already in place. So there's part of the elevator speech. I think we've covered a lot of this, and I'd love, if it's okay, to skip to the top of the next page. Practice enough, sleep well. This is preparing for performance. or even for a lesson the night before, no caffeine, simple meditation, and flooding. You know this technique where like people like me are terrified of going on airplanes, right? So I haven't done this yet, I probably should, but they take you to the airport and everybody gets to sit on a plane. And, you know, you go and do little bits of whatever the thing is you're scared of until finally you can say, been there, done that. Okay, so this is what, when I was at Aspen, I attended this wonderful seminar, all these wonderful people, which included Perlman, who were speaking about, you could just ask questions, you know, from the audience, it's great. Someone asked Perlman about stage fright, and he said, well, you know, I take a year to learn every piece I play. And then he said, and my apartment is like a long thing, so he said, put the violin on the dining room table and I'll come through the swinging kitchen door and then look down through the successive rooms that form the living room. And he said, that armchair is Saul Hurok, and that armchair is Dorothy DeLay, and he kept dropping all these names of really scary people. And he said, and I get myself so nervous. And if you do this right now, I can feel butterflies right now. I got them. So if your student you can say, do you have a good imagination? Usually they'll say yes. Okay, I can imagine butterflies, right? So then pick up the fiddle and play. Practice starting, over and over, practice starting. So I had a little student once whose family was one of these like high-powered people flying all over the world, and she could never get them to pay much attention. So what did she do? She did a reconnaissance mission and found all 12 teddy bears in the house, lined them up on the couch, and she performed for them. Good. She got it. That's an application of flooding for us. So rather than pretending, you know, the elephant in the room is nervousness. So pretending it doesn't exist, rather acknowledging that we all get it, and then finding meditation and flooding as just two possible techniques to cope with it. Permission from inside to be an artist. I knew people at Oberlin that I didn't think were such hot players, and then I saw them go on to have amazing careers in this quartet or in that orchestra. And I finally said to myself, what did they do? What was it? And I realized they gave themselves permission. Who else is going to do it for you? Nobody. Not your teacher, not your parents. It's you. And that's a very empowering thing for kids. You can be an artist, but you have to give yourself permission and commit to the work. Oh, the great conductor. You might wonder what that is. And I will say to them, have you ever sat in an orchestra and you're playing and you think, I know what the conductor wants, but I don't think it should be done that way. Is there anybody in this room who has had that experience? Well, when you play alone, you get to make the choices. And who's the great conductor? Right here. So they choreograph the music, and you can do it without the bow. You know, just the kind of motions you want. It translates into the bow. It translates wonderfully. And it's not our only tool for expression, obviously, but they like the idea of the bow arm. The active bow arm is the great conductor. And suddenly the ideas can begin to flow. So there's lots of ways to encourage experimentation and experience with creativity. And I think that's really what we're talking about. I think I've said what I want to say. It's kind of a mishmash, but it probably does package pretty well if you think about it for a while. And I wondered if there are any other additions, corrections, or questions. Yeah.
So we were talking before about how, that Dorothy DeLay says most of your time should be on, the hardest thing is scales and the pieces should be easy. I tend to give my students pieces, I spend more time giving them drills and exercises and scales and things that they need to build the skills to play the pieces. So I'm always finding that maybe I'm not giving them challenging enough pieces, and for my younger ones, they're perfectly fine with that because they're perfecting the skill, then they get to put in a song and they're fine with that. But my older, more intermediate students keep looking up songs on the internet and coming to me and say, I want to do this now. And I said, well, you're still doing this with your pinky. You know, like all these things are pulling up just things I hear or their friends are may or may not be working on, and I prescribe them what to practice and the order of things to practice. You do this first, and this. And I've gone to asking them, I used to say, you know, how was practicing this week? They'll always say fine. And then sometimes I ask, did you practice this week? They're like, yeah. And I said, what did you practice this week? If I'm sure that they didn't. And then the truth comes out with well, I didn't really. And so now I've started in the beginning of the lesson asking me, tell me about your practicing this week. What did you work on most? You know, those kind of things. And
Everything.
well, I said mostly the drills and saying that this is what you need to put most of your focus on, and just these songs that are review songs just for you to show that you can do it. I asked, what did you practice most this week? And the student came to me and said, oh, the songs. And I said,
Well, you know, if I could just respond to that a little bit, I think you touched on probably another hour's discussion, but it seems to me that if there isn't pleasure in the practicing and the playing, there's no reason to do it. I mean,
Right.
it's bad enough that we go and we ask students to come pay a lot of money for an hour of being told everything they're doing wrong. I mean, think about it. Who would do this?
Exactly.
And so there needs to be some gratification, and I think that there's a nice balance that can be struck between, and I think finding the pleasure in the playing is essential. There has to be, I hate the word joy, but okay, joy. There has to be pleasure in it. There also has to be the work component. And I think what you said back, it isn't exactly what I meant about Miss DeLay. What she said was the hardest thing should be the scales and arpeggios. Then the next hardest thing should be the etudes. And then the next hardest thing, the piece. But she wouldn't shy away from having something that you had to stretch, you know, and I did say there can be some stretch factor in that piece. But also, I mean, if they come to you and they say, I love this piece, I really want to play this piece. And if it's a piece that's reasonably within range, that's a good thing to follow.
yeah, I've let them do that, and I say, okay, so we're going to use this piece to teach you some new skills, which I usually don't like taking a piece and using that to teach them brand new skills, but I've done it because they really wanted to do that. So I said, all right, we'll do that. So we target the skills first before I have them play through the whole thing, and I modify it a little bit for them, like, you know, if it's a certain slurring bowing patterns are just not going to be, like, they should focus on the fingers, I'll say just take away all the slurs and do everything separate bow, just to, you know, to learn this. And
Well, we want to be careful. We don't want to ask them to do anything that's too hard. But on the other hand, if we're too careful, then it's like wrapping them in cellophane. Challenging is good, but giving them the tools to meet the challenges is your job as the teacher, or my job as the teacher. So, for instance, as you were talking about that, I was thinking, well, maybe there would be a nice Mozart, or maybe more likely Kaiser etude that would address some of those bow changes with the string, with the bowings, or some scale work, or something that you could do that would be specific, but I wouldn't hold them back from also doing slow practice, doing open string practice for the crossings and so forth. You know, I mean, I didn't even touch on the whole thing about string crossing. That's a whole other project, wonderful project. You know, but I, well, I would welcome it, but I guess, you know, I wanted to do more of an overview with this, and my thought was that there have been so many people who've been talking about specific skills, and that's a wonderful thing.
I just tried something this last week, and I'm gonna do it a whole lot more, but kids now have so much access to videoing. And the student wasn't just not, I couldn't figure out why. He's done well, but he wasn't getting scales and arpeggios. Something was wrong. So I said, would you record yourself this week? When you come back, I'll watch it. It was so quick to find the problem. It was just like, oh, okay, now I see what you're doing. And my favorite answer is, because I ask kids if they're listening, because I'm very much into their listening to their pieces, and that my favorite answer is, well, not enough. That tells me right away. No.
You know what the other favorite trick in that,
Yeah.
it's good to add that. I videoed myself. Did you watch the video?
Yeah, exactly.
No, I just did it again. I knew what I did wrong.
That's very good,
Yeah.
watching them.
Yeah, they do have to take the time, because
No, we watched it
actually,
together.
it's like, that's part of the the idea of they're becoming their own teacher.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they
That's
see it
great.
as, you know, you're all dressed up to go on a hot date, and you look in the mirror and there's that big mustard stain that you didn't realize was there, right? Well, the mirror told you dispassionately what you didn't feel, right? So we listen kindly to ourselves, but
That's good.
the video is not kind, so we see
I
it.
like the video, I like that the kids can video now,
Yeah.
it's really.
Yeah, it's a wonderful tool, it's
great.
great.